how do we break the cycle if it is at the stage where it is more ingrained?
Okay, look, I might mention a story here too, an anecdote of the example that you're giving where people might become overly wedded to worry, because this was one of the most striking things I ever experienced as a psychologist to understand how ingrained worry could become. And it's based on the mistaken idea that if we worry about something, we're engaging in what might be called the work of worry. That's an expression as though it's productive. And there are times when there's productive worry, but often we can get sucked in to thinking that it's helping us when it's not. And this is an example of a fellow I saw many years ago who let this pattern become very ingrained. He was a fellow who actually for many years had been quite fine with his health and his mental health, but for the previous 10 years or so, he'd become consumed with worry. And it seemed to relate to the past where he had this job at one stage where he was responsible for the electricity supply of a regional area, meaning if something went wrong at night, like a kind of crisis almost, he could be woken up at any time of the night and he'd have to go out and he'd have to fix the electricity lines or the supply in some way. Otherwise, many people would be missing out on their electricity. So it was a very responsible kind of position. And the problem was he kept on getting woken up at night. Well, this had a real impact on him. And he went from having a relatively good level of well-being, but it disrupted his sleep and he became so concerned, anticipating that something might go wrong that night and the next night or whatever, he developed a full-on generalised anxiety disorder. Well, anyway, I saw him a number of years after he'd developed this pattern. He was actually a little older at this stage, but he wanted to learn to worry less at a time when he was around retirement. He'd actually recently retired. And okay, so one of the things we look to do with worry is teaching him a way of bringing down his anxiety level. So we were going to use a relaxation technique. And I remember we're in this regional hospital where I was using this technique with him, and we went through a relaxation session. And he'd gone from being a very shaky, nervous kind of person to he's settled back in the chair, he's breathing deeply, his body was completely calm. His face was very relaxed. For 10, 15 minutes, you could tell he was in quite a trance state. You could tell his body looked very settled and comfortable. At the end of this, I invited him to open his eyes whenever he's ready. And after a number of seconds, he very gradually opened his eyes, which is more the indicator that someone has been in a bit of a trance state. And then when he came back to the room, then suddenly he shook his body. He sort of said, I couldn't relax at all. There was a mower outside and that distracted me the whole time. Now, the thing is, I thought it was such a pity that we'd started this relaxation session and a mower started up right outside. I thought, what a pity, we'll have to stop this session. But he looked so calm, I kept on going. And then I was stunned that afterwards he said that he couldn't relax because the mower was right out the window when his body and his breathing, he was clearly relaxed. What struck me is that he was shaking himself out of that relaxed state as though he was avoiding it, as though there was something uncomfortable about letting go to that extent. And it's like he kicked into this usual mode of worrying about what would happen and feeling nervous and feeling shaky. It's like that was his default state that was very hard to let go of. And recently I learned of a theory that they have about something similar. This was an extreme example, but they talk about sometimes when people have problems with worry, what happens is they can become extra sensitive to some kind of negative emotional shift. In other words, going from being relatively comfortable to really uncomfortable and distressed. And so one way you can kind of prevent that is to keep yourself stressed in the first place. By keeping yourself worried or thinking of what will go wrong, it's a kind of defensive way of being ready for the worst happening. And you could see that with this fellow. He'd become so, in a sense, addicted to worry that he took himself straight back to that state, and it was almost like fleeing from a state of being calm and settled. And I think that was a graphic example of how at times it can be really difficult to let go, to trust in yourself, to trust that things will turn out in certain ways. In fact, it can be an over-controlled way of trying to eliminate distress or prevent that sudden shift from feeling okay to not feeling okay. And unfortunately, the only way we can prevent these sudden disappointments is to keep ourselves like stressed and worried in the first place.